What's happening, everybody? Happy Friday to you. If you're listening to this on another day, then, well, happy Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday to you. Earlier this week, I've been testing out a few different softwares to figure out how we can go live on some of the episodes for Podcast Suck, which is my new podcast about how to start a podcast and also all things podcasting. So, upon the recommendation from my brother from another mother, the one and only Mr. Owen Video, he said Ecamm Live is the way to go. So I've been downloading software this morning, figuring this out. Ecamm Live is a Mac-based software. If you have a PC, sorry about your luck. But hopefully I'm coming in nice and clear on your end there. We're live on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn, allegedly. I just got an error for Instagram. So haven't always been the best live streamer, if you will, but we're trying to mix that up a little bit. What happens, just to preface this episode a little bit, we're going to get into how to market your podcast on other podcasts. But when you go live, it does include some sort of potential technology errors, in addition to just trying to get a podcast episode recorded. So I don't recommend, if you're just getting started, to say, I'm going to live stream all my podcast episodes because, well, there's software and logistics and internet and it didn't hear and I'm not live on Instagram and this didn't happen and there's a bunch of stuff that can go wrong. So just focus on recording your podcast episode, however you do that, whether it's Zoom or Riverside or whatever maybe it's your iPhone. Focus on keeping it as simple as possible. Once you start to catch a rhythm with the show, I've been podcasting for just a smidge of time. So now I'm like, hey, why don't we start to see if we can go live? Because number one, it's an additional piece of content, live content, and then it lives on that platform. It gets turned into a podcast episode. That podcast content gets chopped up into micro content, which can be shared after the podcast episode drops. I could go on and on and on and on. You can transcribe the live. You can transcribe the episode, turn it into a blog post. But just understand, if you're just getting started, don't try to be everything to everybody. I promise you there will be technology issues, and you will get frustrated. You will want to give up. So keep it as simple as possible until you catch a rhythm. All right, let's jump into the episode of how to market your podcast on other podcasts. Now, if you haven't tuned into the show before because you're just catching this live randomly because you got a notification that Sebastian's live, let me be the first to welcome you to the show. I launched a podcast called Podcast Suck, a podcast about how to start a podcast and market and grow a podcast a few weeks back. It's an extension of my book, extension of the talks that I get the opportunity to give, and an extension of everything I've shared on my YouTube channel. If you're watching on YouTube, what's up, everybody? Thanks for tuning in. If not, be sure to subscribe, youtube.com/podcast launch live. It is every single thing that I know about podcasting on one channel. So it's an entire library of well over 100 different videos for you to be able to consume and better understand what it takes to successfully launch a podcast. So these episodes are 10 minutes or less. Sometimes they're 6 minutes. Sometimes they're 5 minutes. Sometimes they go a little bit over, like 11 or 12 minutes. So forgive me, but the goal is to keep this in a short, bite-sized, consumable format where you can go, okay, let me listen to a quick episode, learn something that I didn't know, and get back to my day, go implement it, etc. So we've been talking about podcast marketing over the past few episodes, and I want to cover what it takes to market your podcast on other podcasts. Now, this isn't some ingenious secret that I thought of overnight and thought, well, I got to share this with the world. It's a very common practice, but I don't see a lot of people utilizing it. If you're a podcaster, if you're a business owner, entrepreneur, solopreneur, whatever you do, you should be guesting on other podcasts in addition to being on your podcast. Now, I know a lot of people are like, I don't have a podcast of my own, but I do guest on other podcasts. All right, cool guy or cool girl. You should have your own podcast if you're going to be a guest on another podcast, unless you're a celebrity. And in that case, you probably should have your own podcast anyway, and you probably already do, or there's plans for it. But you can play both sides of the coin. I'm a podcast host, and I'm also a guest on other podcasts. How this specific strategy works is you get booked to be a guest on somebody else's podcast. You're there to talk about what you do, how you do it, how you bring value to the world, your story, what you ate for breakfast, whatever it might be. And during that process, the host should, keyword here, should ask you any things that you may want to talk about specifically during the interview, towards the end of the interview, beginning of the interview, whatever the format is. What do you want to market on this podcast episode? Is there anything I can do to help you? How can I help my audience better understand something about you? Well, I sell widgets, and you can go to widgets.com and learn more about the widgets that we sell. If you have any questions, send me a DM on Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn or wherever you hang out on there. And something that we are extremely excited about that we've just launched a couple of months ago is our brand new podcast. So go to ourpodcastshow.com. You can listen and subscribe. We talk about a lot of the things we've discussed on this podcast episode. You can find the show wherever you consume podcast episodes. That's a great plug for your website, or for your podcast while being a guest on the podcast. Now, there's a couple other things that happen that help that process too. Number one, a good host, a good podcast will include all of your information, your name, where to find you, a quick bio, all your social links, and then a call to action could be listen and subscribe to Sebastian's podcast with this link here. So in the description of their podcast episode that you were a guest on, you're able to actually have your podcast link in there to make it easy for people to listen and subscribe. Now, they can also share micro content from that episode that you were on and include a clip of you talking about your specific podcast. And then guess what? You can turn around and share that content too. And you can share the podcast episode, and you can go out there and say, hey, here's how cool I am. I was on Joe Bob's show, and Joe Bob talked about my show, talked about my business and what I do, but also our brand new podcast. Make sure you listen and subscribe. You can also drop an email to your list. You can post on social media. You can share the post of you being a guest on the podcast. You can plug your podcast in that post. Are you picking up what I'm putting down here? Not enough people are doing that, because the majority of people that are guesting on podcasts probably shouldn't be a guest on a podcast anyway, because there's not enough experience there to bring any massive value. That's why there's so much noise out there when it comes to content in the world of content creation. And I firmly believe that tide's going to go out, and the people that are true creators with absolute total value are going to remain standing. Those that just got into the content game because, well, everybody else is doing it, well, they probably find themselves to the door. That's just my very unpopular opinion. But when it comes to you being a guest on a podcast, if you know you have value to provide, and you're not there to just regurgitate the same motivational quote or information that you heard from Gary Vee or anybody else on your timeline. You're there to share your unique value proposition, I believe is the proper word. Your unique story. Not anybody else's, not retold in any other way. Your specific story. You should be guesting on other podcasts and getting that story out. In addition, you should be promoting your podcast through that process, promoting your podcast by sharing that podcast episode and talking about your podcast, promoting your podcast because you've asked the host to include links to your podcast in the description of the podcast episode you were a guest on. Does that make sense? So next time you have the opportunity to be a guest on a podcast, make sure that the host knows you want to plug the ever-living daylights out of your podcast, and you'd like a link to listen and subscribe included in the description. They can even tag you and the show on any social posts that they do, any clips that they questions from that podcast episode. Make sense? If you have any questions about how this whole process works, it's not a complicated process, but maybe you do have a question. Questions, thoughts, ideas, concerns, whatever it may be, please send me a DM. Comment on this post wherever you may be consuming this post, whether it's YouTube or LinkedIn or Facebook or, well, clearly not Instagram, because Instagram is just not working with the streaming worlds based on what I've set up or thought I had set up this morning. But shoot me a DM. I'm at Podcast Suck on Instagram, Sebastian Rusk on Facebook and LinkedIn, obviously. Send me a message. Say, hey, I listened to your podcast, listen to this episode. I have a question about this, or any episode you have questions on. Please hit me up. I'm here to help, here to answer questions. I do respond to each and every one of you lovely people. I really hope this whole episode streams so we can turn it into a podcast episode. And if not, well, we're just going to try again. That's exactly what we're going to do. You ever ridden a bike before? You ever fallen off that bike? What'd you do? You got right back on that bike, start riding again. That's what we do in the world of podcasting, content creation, and this, well, new venture into live streaming. Hope you guys have a great Friday if you're listening to this on Friday. If not, I hope you're having a great Tuesday, or maybe it's Wednesday or Thursday. Talk to you guys next time.